Snow was falling sideways the night I came back. Not drifting, not gentle. The kind of snow that slaps your face and bends the trees, the kind that makes a man wonder if turning around might have been wiser than walking forward. The whole street was washed in that dim winter glow you only see in small American towns, where every house holds a story no one has the strength to tell out loud. And mine had been silent for far too long. From the sidewalk, Mom's house looked warm, soft lights behind frosted glass, a wreath on the door, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the porch bulb flickering like a dying signal. Maybe it was the wreath itself hanging crooked. Mom never left anything crooked. My truck ticked behind me as the engine cooled, each metallic click echoing through the cold. A single strand of Christmas lights swung along the gutter, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat struggling to hold a rhythm. I stood there for a moment, breath drifting out of me like cigar smoke, trying to make sense of a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a boy. Then I saw it, a shadow moving behind the living room curtain. Slow, intentional, too familiar with the space to be a guest. Curtis's car was parked crooked in the driveway, half buried in snow. And in that instant I knew this wasn't a Christmas homecoming. Something was waiting for me inside. The cold hit first, a sharp kind of cold that crawls under your coat and settles at the base of your neck. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked toward the porch, the old light above the door flickering the same tired amber glow it had when Dad was still around. I stopped at the bottom step, one hand on the rail. 8 months away, and the house looked unchanged, yet something in the air pushed back at me as if warning me I was stepping into a room where the past had been waiting. Inside, the scent of pine and old heater pipes wrapped around me. The furnace rattled in the hallway, knocking in that uneven rhythm I used to listen to when I couldn't sleep as a kid. I stood for a moment by the coat rack, letting the warmth hit my face. The walls felt close, familiar but distant, like a place that remembered me more than the people inside did. Curtis sat at the head of the dining table. My father's chair. He didn't bother hiding it. His posture leaned back just enough to claim the space, his eyes sliding toward me with a quiet satisfaction. He lifted his chin once, a gesture so small it was almost polite, though nothing about it felt friendly. Mom stood by the table arranging Grandma's lace cloth, smoothing the same corner again and again, even though it lay flat. Her hands trembled each time she pressed them down. She wore the red sweater I'd given her last year, a little stretched at the sleeves, threads pulling loose near the cuff. When she turned to greet me, her smile rose quick, then dropped just as fast, like she'd trained herself not to hold joy too long. I set my gloves beside the sink and kissed her cheek. She reached for my arm as if to steady herself, then let go before I could hold her hand. Something had changed, something she didn't want to say. Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Silverware touched plates with soft taps that sounded louder than they should. Curtis watched me from across the table, not blinking much, his fingers drumming near his glass. Mom kept her eyes mostly on her food, only lifting them when she passed the rolls toward me, her hand brushing mine for a brief second before pulling back. Halfway through the meal, Curtis shifted, set his fork down, and rested his elbows on the table. His voice came slow, steady, almost casual. "This house isn't yours anymore, Graham." The words hung there suspended. Mom's breath stuttered, her fork slipping from her fingers and landing against her plate with a faint clink. She didn't speak. She didn't even look up. The room felt smaller, pressing inward with a kind of cold no furnace could drive out. I stared at the walls I had repainted myself last spring. The light switch I replaced, the heater I fixed when it died one January night. Every corner of this place held something of my hands. My time, my effort to keep Mom comfortable after Dad passed. Hearing Curtis lay claim to it felt like someone had reached into my chest and taken something that didn't belong to them. I leaned forward, ready to ask him what he meant, but 3 heavy knocks hit the front door. The sound jolted through the house, sharp and abrupt. Curtis jerked slightly, his eyes cutting toward the hallway. His hand closed around the edge of the table, knuckles pale. Mom started to rise, but I stood faster. The knocks came again, slower this time, as if the person outside knew exactly what they were interrupting. I opened the door and cold air swept in, bringing flakes of snow that landed on the floorboards. Wade Hensley stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, more lines around his eyes, but his presence still carried that same steady weight. He held a thick envelope under one arm, the paper slightly bent from the grip of his glove. "Evening, Graham," he said, and his tone carried something I couldn't place. He glanced past me, saw Mom at the table, saw Curtis sitting stiff in Dad's chair, and his features tightened. "I'm afraid this can't wait." He removed his gloves, slowly placed the envelope on the table between the turkey tray and the basket of rolls no one had touched. The sound it made on the wood was soft but final, the way a judge's gavel might sound if muffled by cloth. Mom sank back into her chair. Curtis didn't move, but a muscle twitched near his jaw. The only noise in the room came from the heater in the hallway, rattling harder than before, as if the old machine was struggling to push through, the tension settling over everything. I closed the door behind Wade, shutting out the cold, though the chill stayed in the air around us. For a long second, none of us spoke. The envelope sat in the center of the table, untouched but loud in its presence. And in that stillness, with the smell of pine and cooling turkey filling the space, I felt something shift beneath the surface of the night. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the quiet understanding that Christmas Eve had stopped being a holiday the moment I stepped inside. It had become the beginning of something else entirely. Something that had been waiting behind ever since in that house. The heater groaned somewhere behind the hallway wall, a low, uneven sound that made the lights tremble above the dining table. Wade rested his hand on the thick envelope he had brought, his fingers tapping once as if he were measuring the weight of the moment. I pulled out the chair across from him, the legs scraping the floor with a tired sigh, and sat down. The table felt smaller than before, crowded with dishes no one had touched. Curtis leaned back, trying to look relaxed, but his thumb rubbed the rim of his glass in tight circles. Mom stood near the stove with her back half turned, her hand hovering over a burner that had already cooled. She touched the knob anyway, a small gesture with no purpose other than to hold on to something solid. Wade slid the envelope toward me. The paper made a soft scraping sound across the wood, a sound that pierced the quiet more than any shout could. He spoke gently, almost too gently for a night like this. "Someone delivered this to my office earlier today." The envelope felt heavy in my hands. I opened it slowly, and a stack of documents slid out, dense with stamps and signatures. The room seemed to lean in as I unfolded the first page. The state seal at the top caught the kitchen light. My mother's name appeared beneath it, neat and steady. Curtis's name followed. A transfer on death deed. My pulse tightened. The heater groaned again, a rumble that sank into the silence like a warning no one wanted to hear. Mom stepped closer, her breath shallow. She tried to speak, but only a thin sound came out, barely enough to hold meaning. When she finally formed words, her voice broke in the middle. "Curtis told me it was just a tax form." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the tablecloth, smoothing the lace again and again with the same nervous pattern she had used since I was a kid. She still referred to look at me. The shame in her posture stung worse than the words on the page. Wade unfolded another sheet from the stack. This one was thinner, printed on affidavit paper. I leaned in, almost afraid to read it. My name was written clearly at the top, but the address was wrong. A street in New Mexico, dated 18 months back. I had never lived anywhere near that place. Wade's voice lowered. It wasn't the tone of a lawyer anymore. It was the tone of someone who hated what they had to explain. This claims you changed residency last year. If that were true, this house would bypass you completely. I stared at the place where my signature should never have been. The strokes were similar enough to pass at a glance, but crooked heavier at the wrong angles. It looked like someone tracing a memory of my hand. Mom whispered something I couldn't hear. She pressed both hands flat against the table as if steadying herself. The Christmas tree in the living room cast shifting colors against her shoulder. Red, green, red. The glow made her look even smaller than she already was. Curtis cleared his throat. He tried to smile, but only managed something thin and brittle. "Let's not ruin Christmas, Graham. Paperwork gets messy." His voice strained at the edges as if he were trying to sound casual while keeping something from slipping out. His eyes flicked once toward the hallway, quick and nervous until he forgot to hide. I didn't answer him. My jaw locked the way it did when I fought fires years ago, when you stand in smoke and instinct tells you not to inhale too deep. I kept my focus on Mom instead. Her shoulders curved inward the way someone bends when they expect a hit that never comes. I set the documents down gently, though my hands had started to shake. Something cold settled between my ribs. I didn't say anything, but the weight of what had been done, of how long it must have been happening, pressed hard. Mom suddenly stepped away from the table. She went to the sink and gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. The faint sound of her breath breaking made the room feel colder. Wade spoke again now, looking directly at Curtis. This wasn't an accident. The affidavit was created deliberately. Someone intended to remove Graham from the line of succession. Curtis lifted his glass as if to drink, but the rim stopped short of his lips. He placed it back down slowly and wiped his palm against his thigh. His eyes darted toward the back door, then to the papers, then to Wade. His calm facade was slipping. A faint hum from the refrigerator filled the silence. Outside, snow tapped softly against the kitchen window. The holiday decorations in the living room glowed steady out of place in the tension building between us. Wade's gaze shifted to Mom. She finally turned around, tears forming at the corner of her eyes, her face pale with something deeper than fear. She whispered an apology without saying the word, a breath more than a sentence. "I want to help," she said, barely audible. I walked to her side, stopping close enough that she could lean if she needed to. She didn't, but she stayed near. The distance between us had been growing for months, maybe years, and it felt like we were both standing at the edge of that realization. Behind us, Curtis muttered under his breath, the annoyance creeping back. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." Wade placed a steady hand on the documents, anchoring them to the table. "This is a calculated attempt to seize property, and the timing is no coincidence." Curtis froze mid-breath as if the words had pinned him for a moment too long. The house fell silent. Even the heater paused between cycles. Mom's fingers curled against the counter. Wade watched Curtis with quiet, measured patience. I stood beside my mother, feeling something settle inside me. Something calm but heavy, the kind of weight that comes before a storm. The tree lights flickered once across the envelope on the table, casting red and green pulses over the state seal and my mother's signature. The sight held me still, and in that small flicker I sensed it. The truth wasn't done coming. There were deeper layers waiting, darker corners no one had touched yet. Something bigger was about to surface. The kitchen light steadied after a brief flicker, casting a pale glow over the table where the documents lay. I set my hand on the chair to steady myself, the wood cool under my palm. Behind me, the hallway vent opened with a thump as the heater kicked back on. The warm air drifted across my shoulder, but it didn't reach the tight place forming in my chest. I walked into the living room needing a breath that didn't feel borrowed. The Christmas tree lights blinked in uneven patterns, their glow throwing soft shadows across the walls. One of the bulbs buzzed faintly, a sound just sharp enough to cut into the quiet. The room felt smaller than I remembered, as if the years I spent rebuilding it had collapsed into a single heavy memory. I rested my hand on the back of the couch. The fabric had faded from the sun the same way it had when I first returned to this house. After the fire injured my back and pulled me out of the life I once knew. Back then I had nothing but jagged mornings, nights that wouldn't end, and a house that looked as broken as I felt. Fixing it became the only thing that kept me standing. Every board I replaced, every pipe I tightened felt like stitching pieces of myself back together. The furnace used to die without warning during those first winters. I spent nights in the basement with tools spread across cardboard, tightening bolts through the ache in my hands. I rewired the old breaker box one weekend when the lights kept cutting out, crawling through the attic beams while dust burned my throat. The roof, the porch rail, even the siding, I rebuilt them all because Mom couldn't face doing it alone after losing Dad. And because it was the last thing I knew how to do that still made me feel whole. Behind me, I heard quiet footsteps. Mom stood near the doorway, her fingers resting lightly on the frame. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The weight in her eyes told me more than words. I wanted to ask how long she had known something was wrong, how long she had been afraid to tell me. But the question lodged in my throat, and I let it stay there. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was sharp enough to break the stillness. Tom's name lit up the screen. I stepped into the mudroom before answering the cold seeping through the cracks in the window. He spoke in a lowered voice. "You home now, Graham?" I told him I was. There was a pause long enough that I could hear the wind hitting his porch railing. "Been meaning to check with you. Just wasn't sure it was my place." His hesitation made something inside me sink. He continued, "I've seen Curtis in your garage these past months, copying papers, whole stacks." He always shut the door fast if he heard footsteps. Didn't want anyone near. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cool surface through my shirt. "What kind of papers?" Tom breathed out slow. "Hard to say. Looked like legal stuff. Saw envelopes from offices, too. He always grabbed the mail early before your mom came out." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled in my stomach. "Why didn't you call sooner, Tom?" "I didn't know if it mattered," he said. "Thought it might be medical or financial. I didn't want to make things worse for your mom." He paused again, then quietly added, "But tonight I saw your truck in the driveway. Figured you needed to know." We ended the call after that. I stood still for several seconds, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the wind pushing against the back door, the rattle of the heater in its new cycle. All the sounds of a house that held too many years, too many secrets pressing inward. When I returned to the kitchen, Wade stood near the counter talking softly to Mom. She held her hands folded against her chest, fingers curled tight. Her voice was faint, barely audible under the hum of the lights. Curtis stood near the window, his reflection faint against the glass. His shoulders were tight, his jaw stiff, one hand tucked halfway into his pocket. He watched the snow fall, but his eyes weren't really on the yard. He was somewhere else, calculating, searching for the next angle. I walked to the table. The documents Wade had brought lay in a neat stack, but the sight of them made the room tilt slightly. I touched the top page lightly, not ready to lift it again. Instead, I looked toward the hallway where Dad's old flannel jacket hung on the coat rack. The fabric had thinned over the years, one sleeve patched with cloth Mom found in a drawer. I stared at it a long moment, feeling something in my chest tighten in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. The Christmas lights outside pulsed again, casting a brief red glow across the table. It struck the edge of the affidavit, the forged signature, catching the light just enough to remind me of everything that had led to this night. The flicker played across my fingers, then across Mom's face as she watched from the doorway. Her expression held a mix of sadness and guilt, a weight she had carried alone far too long. Curtis turned from the window and looked at me. His expression was briefly unmasked, raw, with something colder than anger. It vanished quickly, replaced by the same forced calm he had tried to use all evening. "All this fuss over some paperwork," he muttered under his breath. He was trying to shrink the moment, to pull the house back under his control, but the cracks in his voice told another story. I didn't answer. I simply stepped closer to Mom, standing beside her so she didn't have to face the room alone. Her hand brushed mine for a second before she withdrew a small gesture, but it said everything she couldn't say out loud. The room felt still then, too still. Even the heater stopped its rattling as if waiting for something to shift. A car drove by outside, tires crunching faintly over the snow, the sound fading into the night. I looked at the siding through the window, the section I had repainted myself the winter after the accident. Under the flickering lights, it looked almost distorted, as if the house had been holding its breath just as long as we had. Curtis hadn't rushed into this. He hadn't acted out of impulse. He'd spent months, maybe longer, using the home I rebuilt as the centerpiece of something twisted and deliberate. And standing there in the quiet of that kitchen, I felt the truth closing in. Not loud, not sudden, but slow and certain. A storm gathering behind the walls, waiting for the moment it would finally break. The chair scraped lightly against the floor as I pulled it back in and sat down again. My hand brushed the corner of the top document and the paper trembled under my fingers. The heater clicked in the hallway, sending a warm draft across the kitchen that only made the tension feel colder. Mom eased into the chair beside me, close enough that I could hear the thin break in her breath each time she tried to steady it. Wade rested both palms on the table for a moment before speaking. He watched the papers the way a man watches a lit fuse. His voice stayed even, but there was weight behind it, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how bad the truth is going to sound. "Residency determines everything in a transfer on death deed," he said quietly. "If a child no longer lives in the state, the document bypasses them entirely. Someone filed a change of residency for you. The proof came from a real utility account in New Mexico. Same name, different life." My fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the affidavit. The room seemed to pull in around me. I had spent the last year traveling no farther than the grocery store and the clinic on the west side. The idea that my existence had been rewritten on paper felt unreal, but the seal at the bottom of the page said otherwise. Curtis shifted near the window. He reached for a glass of water, then stopped halfway and pretended to study the snow falling outside. His reflection in the glass flickered between the colors from the Christmas tree in the living room. I caught a hint of his jaw clenching before he masked it with a slow breath. Wade continued with steady patience. "Curtis used to work in debt recovery. Those databases keep fragments of personal data for years. Old utility records, past addresses, partial account numbers. Enough information to create a version of you that looked official to the state." Mom lifted her hand slightly as if to defend herself, then let it fall again. Her eyes dropped to the table, following the lace edge of the runner she had flattened and reflattened all night. "I did not understand everything you were dealing with," she whispered. "After the surgery, I was tired. I trusted him." Her voice thinned at the end. I felt her fingers brush the back of my hand before retreating. Not pulling away, just uncertain. I turned to Wade. How did he get the deed notarized? Wade slid a second document forward. The notary stamp sat at an angle faint around the edges as if pressed in a hurry. He arranged a home visit while your mother was still recovering, Wade said. It was during a snow warning last February. The notary came close to closing hours. They saw a woman in bed, pale, quiet, slow to speak after medication. Curtis told them she was groggy but fine. He insisted it was urgent paperwork. The notary made a poor judgment call and relied on his word. Mom brought her hands to her face. A slow breath escaped her, strained and uneven. I had seen her vulnerable before, but never with fear mixed in. The kind of fear that comes from realizing someone used your trust as a tool. I remember lying there, she said softly. He kept saying it was routine. His voice sounded close to my ear. I did not want to disappoint anyone. Her hands shook. She pressed them together as if she could keep the memory from shaking loose. The kitchen grew unbearably still. The refrigerator hummed in the background. The Christmas lights from the living room cast a soft red glow across the counter. Somewhere outside, a car rolled down the street, tires crunching gently over the snow before fading out. Wade lowered his voice. This is not just a forged change of residency or an inappropriate deed. This enters the territory of elder financial exploitation. Courts handle it as a serious offense. The words hung there heavy and certain. Curtis stopped pretending to watch the snow fall. His shoulders stiffened. His fingers twitched once at his side as if he had almost clenched a fist and caught himself. He tried to speak. His voice hitched before settling. This is all being blown out of proportion. He reached for the faucet, ran the water for a moment, and filled half a glass, but his hand shook just enough that a few drops spilled onto the counter. He wiped them quickly with the edge of his sleeve, trying to hide the motion. I watched him longer than I meant to. The man who had held himself tall all evening now kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other as if the floor beneath him had turned unsteady. Mom whispered my name. When I looked at her, she shook her head once, not in denial, but in something closer to sorrow. The kind that settles behind the ribs and stays there. Wade collected the documents into a neat line. He did not close the folder yet. Instead, he placed his hand flat over the forged affidavit, grounding it to the table. We can challenge all of this, he said, but the court will want everything you remember, every detail. Mom nodded, though her eyes were unfocused, staring somewhere in a memory none of us could see. I pushed back from the table and walked toward the hallway. Dad's old flannel jacket hung there, one sleeve patched, the fabric softened by years of work and winter air. I let my fingers hover inches from it. Not touching, just close enough to feel its presence the way you feel the heat of a stove before you set your hand on it. The jacket had survived storms, repairs, decades, but the house it hung in had nearly been stolen with a signature pressed into paper by a woman half asleep. A gust of wind struck the front windows. The lights flickered once, painting the kitchen in brief shadows. Curtis swallowed hard, trying to stand still, but his breath gave him away. A sharp inhale, a stuttered exhale. I returned to the table. Wade closed the folder at last, the soft thud landing like the end of something. Or maybe the start. The heater quieted. Mom lowered her eyes. Curtis's reflection in the window trembled with the tree lights behind him. And in that fragile hush, I felt it again. The sense that we had only uncovered the first layer. Whatever lay underneath was waiting closer now, shifting in the dark, like something about to step forward. The heater came back on with a low tremor, but the warmth never reached the kitchen table. Mom kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, the same one she brought out every Christmas, smoothing it with slow, nervous strokes. When I sat beside her, she shifted just enough for me to notice, yet not enough to look at me. Curtis stood near the counter pretending to read a grocery list stuck to the fridge, though his shoulders were too tight for the act to pass as casual. Mom lifted her gaze for the briefest moment, then dropped it again. That tiny avoidance cut deeper than anything she had said so far. Her breath shook as she steadied her hands on the table. A small click sounded as her thumbnail tapped the wood. It reminded me of nights she used to tap on my door when I was a kid, checking if I was awake after a nightmare. He kept my debit cards. They stayed in his wallet. She said it simply without looking up. The words carried no blame, only the confession of someone who had run out of places to hide the truth. He said it made things easier, that I didn't need to worry. Curtis shifted his weight, flattening the dish towel on the counter with a little more force than necessary. He pressed his lips together in a thin line, the kind a man wears when he wants to appear calm but is counting each second until the conversation ends. Mom breathed in again, deeper this time, as if pulling the next memory from far away. He opened all my medical mail before I saw any of it. Every letter. The Christmas tree lights cast a slow sweep of colors across the wall behind her. Red, green, amber. Each glow passed over her face like someone turning pages too softly for sound. She blinked when she mentioned finding one of her cardiologist's letters in the trash. Her fingers curled slightly at the memory. I wasn't supposed to see it. I only found it because the trash bag tore when I pulled it out. I felt something scrape inside my chest. A guilt that didn't come loud but steady, the kind you can't shake loose no matter how deeply you breathe. I thought of every time I told her I'd stop by next week instead of now. Every birthday card sent in a rush. Every voicemail recorded between shifts. Mom reached toward her water glass, hesitated, then set her hand down again. One morning I couldn't find my pills. He put them up on the top shelf. I could barely reach them. His voice was calm when he said the doctor changed the dosage, but the bottle was the same. I knew it was the same. Her voice didn't shake this time. It thinned, but held. Curtis turned toward the sink, running the faucet for a second before shutting it off again. A weak attempt to reclaim control of the room. Wade didn't even look up from his notes. He let the silence press down on Curtis instead. Mom pressed her palm flat to the table, steadying herself. When she spoke again, the sound was quieter. There was a night when he was on the phone. His voice was low. I heard him say just one more signature. Then he saw me and closed the door. Wade lifted his head, listening. I saw the recognition in his eyes. Not surprise, but confirmation. Patterns he had probably seen in other homes, other families torn apart by trust placed in the wrong hands. Mom's face softened with shame. I didn't tell you, she said. I was afraid he would leave. And I did not want to be by myself again. Not after your father. I leaned in my hands, closing gently around hers. The pressure in my chest tightened, then settled the way a bruise spreads when touched. I had spent so much of the past year convincing myself that distance was fine, that she had company, that she was managing. I mistook convenience for care. Curtis's voice drifted from the counter, low and tight. She wanted help. I only did what she asked. Mom flinched not at his words but at the tone. Something brittle passed through her expression, a realization more than a reaction. She straightened her spine, drawing in a breath that seemed to change the air around her. Wade closed his notebook halfway. Linda, has he ever kept you from speaking with your doctor? Mom hesitated. Her eyes moved toward the hallway, then to a cabinet drawer near the stove. She rested her fingers lightly on the tablecloth. There was a call I missed. My doctor left a message about renewing a medication. I never saw the letter that followed. He told me it was handled. A soft thud echoed from the hallway. Curtis's footsteps stopped just out of sight and the silence grew thick around us. Mom looked down, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet mine. The look held no apology this time, only clarity, and something close to resolve. The refrigerator hummed again, but the sound felt distant, like it belonged to another house. I felt the shift in her, a small reclaiming of something she had been forced to give up. She took one more breath. There is something else I remember. I didn't think about it before, but now, it doesn't feel right. Her voice thinned into the space between us, leaving the end of the thought hanging like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. And in that quiet, I knew whatever she was about to reveal next would change everything we thought we understood. The kitchen had gone still after Mom's unfinished memory, a quiet so deep, it felt like the house was waiting for someone to breathe first. The heater rumbled through the vents, then settled again, leaving only the faint tick of the wall clock marking time that no one in the room seemed to follow. Wade sat with his hands resting on his briefcase, studying Mom with the patience of someone who understood that truth needed gentleness, not force. He opened the briefcase. The soft metallic clicks drew Curtis from the hallway like a shadow pulled by sound. Mom's eyes flicked toward the movement, then back to Wade's hands. Her shoulders tightened as though bracing for something she could not name. Wade placed a small recorder on the table. He didn't push it toward us. He simply let it sit there, a quiet weight between all of us. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that made everything else lean in to listen. There is something you both need to hear. Curtis stepped closer, trying to mask the tension in his posture. His face composed itself into something neutral, but his thumb pressed hard along the seam of his pocket. Mom's breath shortened, her fingers curling lightly around the fabric of the tablecloth. Wade pressed play. A faint hum came first, like air moving through a narrow vent. Then the voice broke through. Curtis's voice. Once Linda's gone, the house goes straight to me. Graham's out of state, legally irrelevant. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I reached for her, steadying her arm, feeling the tremor under my fingers. Her eyes stayed fixed on the recorder, widening as each familiar inflection confirmed what she already feared. Wade paused the playback. Linda, do you want a moment? She shook her head, though her hand stayed over her heart. The Christmas lights reflected faint colors across her face, soft but unnerving. Like the room could not decide whether it belonged to the holiday or the truth settling into it. Wade pressed play again. Curtis's voice rose with a confidence I had heard before when he wanted people to think he was the smartest man in the room. You don't have to worry about the son. He's a grease-stained mechanic who doesn't know a thing about law. Hand him the right paperwork and he'll fold before he knows what happened. Curtis's jaw tightened as he listened to himself mock me. He tried a small smile, thin and forced. People say things, he muttered. You don't know the context. Wade did not acknowledge the comment. The recording kept going. And if it happens sooner than expected, that's even better. The words slowed the air in the room. Mom made a soft sound, nearly silent but sharp enough to cut through me. Her eyes glistened not from tears alone, but from the sickening recognition of what those words implied. Wade turned off the recorder and let the silence settle around us before speaking. This suggests intent. At minimum, it supports opening an elder abuse investigation. Curtis finally snapped out of his stunned silence, leaning forward with a feigned indignation. You can't take that at face value. Everyone talks big, especially when they think they're impressing someone. That could be years old. It could be taken out of context. Wade nodded slightly as if acknowledging the possibility. Audio forensics will tell us more. Curtis blinked, thrown off by the calm response. I recognized the look on his face, the one he wore when someone didn't react the way he wanted them to. A crack appeared in the mask he had built for himself. Mom lowered her hand from her chest, Her voice trembled as she tried to form the shape of a question. He wished I was gone. Curtis shook his head quickly, forcing a sympathetic expression. Linda, that is not what this is. I would never. Wade lifted a hand, cutting him off without raising his voice. Let her finish. Mom blinked, the motion slow and deliberate. She looked at Curtis, really looked, and something in her expression changed. Not anger, understanding, the kind that arrives late but lands hard. I remembered something else, she said. It happened last month. The room leaned into her words. Even Curtis stilled. I asked him to drive me to the pharmacy because the snow was coming in. She hesitated. He told me the car wouldn't start, but later I saw him leave in it. She drew a slow breath. He didn't want me to refill my medication. Curtis reacted quickly, too quickly. It wasn't safe for you to drive in the snow. I went to get things we needed. His tone reached for justification but thinned under the strain. Wade wrote a note without looking up. I watched Curtis's hands. They were restless fingers opening and closing against his jeans. A man calculating. A man realizing the room was no longer bending to him. Wade leaned back slightly. There is something else you should know. The person who sent this recording didn't stumble onto it by accident. Curtis's head snapped up. What does that mean? Wade's gaze didn't shift. It means someone who knows you or knew you has reason to pay attention. The refrigerator hummed again, a low vibration through the floor. Snow tapped against the window in small bursts like quiet knock after quiet knock. Mom whispered almost to herself. Someone knew what he was planning. I felt it then, the same pressure I used to feel walking toward a burning building, the sense that something hidden was waiting just beyond the smoke. Not a threat. Not this time. Something else. Someone else. Curtis stayed silent now, but his breath had grown uneven. Wade closed his notebook. We are not at the end of this. There is more coming. The lights on the tree flickered softly in the next room. A gentle pulse that cast moving shadows across the hallway. Mom's hand slipped into mine. Her fingers were cold but steadier than before. And in that quiet moment I felt it clearly. The truth wasn't just opening. It was being pushed forward by someone who had seen Curtis's darkness long before it reached our door. The snow had thickened into a steady curtain by the time Sheriff Briggs asked me to follow him outside. The cold met us the moment we stepped off the porch, pushing against our faces like a quiet warning. I kept my hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of everything that had come to light pressing deeper than the winter air. Briggs walked ahead, silent except for the steady crunch of his boots on the driveway. That sound, rhythmic and unhurried, made the whole night feel heavier. When he reached Curtis's car, he paused for a moment, as if considering the right angle to lift the truth. His hand rested on the metal. Then he opened the trunk with a quick, firm motion. The latch snapped sharp enough to echo through the stillness. A breath of cold air rushed inside, and the beam of his flashlight cut across the contents. There, untouched, lay the unopened box of Mom's heart medication. Beside it was a folder thick with documents, edges softened from handling. On top of the stack sat a small USB drive, with a strip of tape across it, the word timeline written in Curtis's tight handwriting. Briggs didn't speak right away. He lifted the USB with the care of someone handling a fragile truth, then nodded for me to hold the light. I stepped closer, letting the beam settle on the paperwork as he opened the folder. The first page carried a neat series of dates and financial projections. It laid out what looked like potential sale windows, property values, and payout estimates. But my breath caught when I saw the second column. In case of cardiac decline. The word sat on the page with no hesitation, no softness, no space between planning and outcome. I stared at them, letting the flashlight drop a little, and the snow drifted into the trunk like dust settling on a grave. Briggs turned a few more pages, his expression hardening. There were drafts of life insurance forms, reminders to cancel certain appointments, and notations that matched the timeline Wade had mentioned inside. Nothing was messy or rushed. Everything looked rehearsed. "This looks deliberate," he said in a quiet voice. I felt the truth of it in my sternum, like something heavy had hooked itself inside me. The image of Mom sitting at the table flashed in my mind, her voice soft, her fingers tightening around a napkin as she talked about the control Curtis had held over her daily life. That memory hit harder now, colored by the realization of what she might have been headed toward. Briggs closed the folder, then reached for a second envelope tucked beneath the stack. Inside were printed emails, each one discussing hypothetical property values and insurance matters. They were written like casual inquiries, but the timing matched the dates on the first document. It was as if he'd been building two versions of the same future, one on paper and one in his head. The sheriff let the papers settle back into the trunk, then straightened slowly. "I need to tell you something," he said. His breath rose in the air, drifting toward the nearest streetlight before dissolving. I waited, keeping the flashlight steady even as my hand tightened around it. This isn't the first time someone raised concerns about him. He was looked into back in Kentucky. I felt the cold press deeper. For what? Briggs met my eyes. Something similar. His wife disappeared before they could prove anything. No clear evidence, no conclusion. The snow kept falling gentler now, as if the world outside didn't want to hear what he had just said. I let the silence sit between us, heavy and sharp. The idea of Curtis walking away from something like that, moving here, stepping into my mother's life with that same smile and those same quiet assurances, set my jaw tight. Briggs closed the trunk. "We need to bring him in." Mom's silhouette passed behind the living room curtain as we walked back to the porch. She moved slowly, almost ghost-like in the lamplight, unaware of the depth of what we'd found. When we reached the steps, Curtis stood there waiting. His arms were folded and his expression was unreadable, but I saw the flicker in his eyes as Briggs approached. "Curtis, the sheriff said you're being detained during this investigation." Curtis's jaw shifted, though his voice stayed calm. "You people are making a mistake." Briggs didn't argue. He reached for the cuffs, moving with the same quiet authority he'd carried all night. Curtis stepped back instinctively, his shoulder hitting the siding. For a moment his mask faltered. Then he looked at me. It wasn't a glare at first, it was something colder. A calculation unfinished. He let Briggs secure one wrist, then he spoke barely above a whisper. "You didn't know when to quit." The way he said it made my breath shorten. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't anger. It was disappointment that his plan had been interrupted. Briggs fastened the other cuff and began guiding him toward the cruiser. The snow shifted under their weight. Curtis kept turning his head, searching for my face in the dark, until finally our eyes met under the porch light. His expression pulled tight at the edges, something brittle showing through. He didn't say another word, but the silence said enough. When they reached the cruiser, Briggs opened the door and Curtis paused, the cold mist of his breath drifting around him. His gaze moved past me to the house, to the window where my mother stood. For a second I wondered if he regretted anything. Then the moment passed and all I saw was a man watching a plan collapse. Briggs closed the door and the cruiser lights blinked to life, blue and red scattering across the snow and the siding I had painted years earlier. The colors flickered against the windows, stretching long shadows across the living room walls. The car pulled away, its tires hushing through the slush. The lights disappearing slowly down the street until only the wind was left. I stood on the driveway for a long time. The house behind me breathed its quiet, uneven warmth. The snow ahead of me kept falling layer upon layer, covering the tire marks until the path seemed untouched again. Somewhere between those two spaces I felt the truth settle in my chest. The danger wasn't over, but the silence no longer belonged to him. The floor creaked softly when Wade rose from his chair, the sound small yet sharp enough to cut through the room. A draft slipped in from the hallway and brushed the back of my neck, carrying the faint scent of cold pine from the porch. Mom pulled her sweater tighter, almost as if she felt it too. Wade set a thick folder on the coffee table, and the lamp beside him flickered once before steadying again. For a moment, it all felt like the house itself was listening. He opened the folder, his fingers slow, deliberate. Papers rustled in a way that made my chest tighten. Not from fear exactly, but from something heavier, something like the return of a storm long forgotten. Wade studied a document, then looked at me as if asking for permission before he spoke. "Your father left something behind, something he never told anyone." Mom straightened in her seat, her hands clasped hard enough for the veins to rise. I leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking under my weight. The room felt smaller, almost crowded by the silence. Wade laid a single page in front of me. The trust papers were old edges yellowed, ink fading in places. But the signature, my father's signature, was still strong and clear. The lamplight caught the pen stroke, making it shimmer faintly. It stopped me cold. I had not seen that handwriting in years, yet it hit me like he had signed it only yesterday. Wade spoke quietly, as if not to disturb something sacred lingering in the air. He said the trust carried a clause my father added after the fire decades ago, a clause he must have believed we would one day need. Any fraudulent attempt to seize the family home automatically locked the assets, froze transfers, and pushed control to a protective trust that only a court could unwind. A safety latch built for a future he feared we might face. Mom lowered her head. I watched her thumb move slowly over the edge of her sleeve, a small tremor passing through it. She whispered that my father became cautious after the fire, after watching our roof cave in and nearly losing everything. But she said it like she wished she had remembered it sooner, like it was a memory she had kept on a high shelf too long. Something inside me tightened. I had lived in that same house, walked the same floors, touched the same beams he rebuilt after the blaze, yet I had never thought to look deeper into his papers. Maybe I should have. Maybe I had been too busy, too tired, too wrapped up in my own pieces of grief to notice what he had quietly left behind. Wade continued turning over more pages, showing how Curtis had dug through old boxes, searching for loopholes he didn't fully understand. He must have believed the faded facts he found was the key, the weak point in the armor. Mom remembered seeing him smile after finding it, though she had not understood why at the time. Now we knew. He thought he was holding a door half open. He never saw the steel frame behind it. A gust of wind struck the window when Wade pushed another sheet forward. The glass thudded gently, and the Christmas lights outside jittered against the siding in a rapid, uneasy pulse. For a second, the whole room brightened and dimmed like a heartbeat skipping. Wade said the protective clause gave us the strongest legal footing possible. The TOD deed, even if it had looked clean, would have been swallowed by the trust the moment his fraud touched it. Hard proof, no ambiguity. A wall my father had built long before Curtis learned to manipulate vulnerable people. Long before I knew that our family would ever need such a thing. Mom lifted the page and stared at her husband's signature. Her lips pressed together, not in sadness, but in something closer to relief mixed with regret. I could almost see the years slipping over her face. She whispered that she wished she had told me sooner about the old files, the odd days when Curtis spent hours rummaging in the attic. I told her softly that none of this was her fault. She looked at me with eyes that didn't quite believe it, but she nodded anyway. Behind her, the old photo of my father on the mantel caught the lamplight, the reflection slicing across the glass. It made his face look half in shadow, half in glow, almost as if he were standing there with us, steady and silent. I felt a warmth in my chest, not comforting exactly, but grounding, like a hand on the shoulder from someone who no longer had hands. Curtis had planned for months, maybe years, but my father had planned for a lifetime. Wade closed the folder slowly. "There is more to check," he said, tapping the cover gently. "A few documents are missing from the set. They could be in the house or they could be somewhere Curtis hid. Either way, we need to find them before morning." Mom inhaled sharply, a small startled breath that cut through the quiet. The lamp flickered again, dimming for a heartbeat, then returning to steady glow. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything on my shoulders, but also a new kind of strength rising beneath it. We had one shield left from the man who raised me, and now it was my turn to use it. Wade gathered the folder. The house settled with a soft pop in the wood, the way old houses do when they brace for cold. Somewhere in the hallway, something shifted, a faint thump like a drawer closing on its own or a box settling under its weight. I looked toward the dark hallway, then back at the folder in Wade's hand. Whatever waited next was already moving toward us. Wade's office felt smaller than it had the night before. The heater kicked on with a low groan that rattled the vents, sending a thin line of warm air across my legs. I set my father's old folder on the edge of the table, the one Wade had used to explain the trust clause. And I kept my hand there a moment longer than needed. The papers under my palm felt solid, almost like a pulse, something alive that connected past and present. Outside the window, the reflection of passing headlights streaked across the frost, breaking the quiet in thin silver smears. That was when the door opened. A woman stepped in, lean and pale, in a way that suggested she had learned to live on small breaths and small movements. She glanced around as if checking exits, then looked at me with an expression that carried more history than introduction. Wade rose slowly, greeting her with a softness I had not seen him use for anyone else in this mess. "Her name was Maggie Hale," he said, though she barely reacted to hearing it spoken aloud, as if she had not heard her own name in years. She sat across from us without taking off her coat. Snow clung to the bottom hem, melting across the carpet. She placed a canvas tote on the table and waited, letting the office settle. Mom watched her with a mixture of fear and curiosity, the same look she used to give when neighbors brought stray animals to the porch. I could tell she sensed danger and gentleness tangled together. I asked quietly how she had found us. Maggie lifted her gaze, steady but tired. She said she checked the property registry in Kentucky every month, not out of paranoia, but because a woman at the shelter had once handed her a pamphlet titled "Warning Signs for Survivors." One line mentioned monitoring known abusers if you feared they might resurface. She had looked at that registry so many times it became a ritual, like checking locks at night. 2 weeks ago, she saw Curtis's name attached to a new deed, and the breath left her chest. She said she packed a bag and drove straight through the night until she crossed into Ohio, stopping only once for gas. She opened the tote with slow, deliberate fingers. Inside were recordings, each sealed in separate envelopes, and a notebook so worn the edges curled upward. She laid them out one by one. The soft paper sounds filled the room like the rustle of dry leaves. Mom reached for my arm, gripping lightly as if steadying herself. My breath tightened as Maggie pushed a small recorder toward us. She did not play it yet, only traced its edge with her thumb. She explained that years ago Curtis had rehearsed the very same strategy he used on my mother. The TOD deed, the forged affidavits, the staged medical concerns. Even the language in some of the documents was identical. When she said this, I felt a coldness crawl across my shoulders, something heavier than the winter outside. It connected every uneasy moment of the past days into something larger than coincidence. Maggie paused and looked at each of us in turn. She said there had been an attorney in Lexington who had shown Curtis how to exploit loopholes based on names records and jurisdiction transfers. The lawyer had since disappeared or changed firms, she wasn't sure, but Curtis had kept handwritten notes from their meetings and she had taken pictures before she fled. She slid those photos across the table. Wade pulled them closer, scanning with a frown, tapping his pen against the margin of one page as though confirming a pattern he suspected. Mom whispered a short question asking if Maggie had ever tried going to the police. Maggie nodded without anger, simply describing how the officers told her she needed clearer proof, something more concrete. By the time she gathered enough, she said she was too afraid to return home and face him. The town chalked her disappearance up to a bitter divorce and relocation. No one questioned it. She said she had lived under borrowed names for 2 years before she felt safe enough to breathe normally. Hearing this, something unsettled moved inside me. A mixture of pity for her and a gnawing shame that my own mother had come so close to the same edge. Wade leaned back his chair, creaking in the heavy silence. He asked gently why she chose to come now after years of hiding. Maggie studied the frost outside the window, her face softening. She said she came because she recognized the structure of the new deed instantly, like a scar you feel even in the dark. She said she could not ignore the possibility that another woman, another family was being pulled toward the same cliff she escaped. When she looked at my mother, something in her voice tightened. She said Curtis never stopped on his own. He only stopped when someone made him stop, either through the law or through something far worse. Hearing those words, I felt my jaw clench. Mom bowed her head slightly as though hearing her own near future described by a survivor. Wade slid the notebook back to her and thanked her for coming. She shook her head, saying she was only doing what she wished someone had done for her. She stood slowly gathering the tote but left the recordings and copies behind. She said we would need them more than she ever would. As she moved to the door, snowlight flickered across her face. She gave me a small nod, one that held both warning and solidarity. Then she stepped into the hallway, her silhouette fading into the glow of the exit light. The room felt colder after she left. I stared at the pile of evidence on the desk. In the glass of the office window, I saw my reflection hovering above it, dim and uncertain. Beyond the parking lot, a police cruiser drifted by its headlights, sweeping across the snow like a quiet reminder that something larger, darker had only now begun to take shape. The wind pushed hard against the courthouse doors as I stepped inside, scattering snow across the entryway and shaking loose whatever steadiness I had left. My coat was still damp from the walk across the lot, and for a moment I stood there listening to the low hum of people settling into benches, their voices softened by the weight of winter. The air smelled faintly of old radiator heat and wet wool. It grounded me even as my pulse kept a steady climb. Curtis was already seated at the defendant's table. His shoulders rounded inward, his suit too loose across the back as if he had shrunk inside it. The arrogance he once carried like a second skin had drained completely from him. He looked up when I entered, just long enough to register my presence, then looked away like a man who had stared too long into a mirror he didn't recognize. The judge called the session to order and the room shifted with that small collective exhale people take when something serious begins. Wade organized his files beside me, his movements calm and practiced. Beside him sat my mother, wrapped in a wool shawl she had worn every winter for at least 20 years. Her hand tightened around mine for a moment, just enough for me to feel the tremor she tried to hide. The prosecution began with a simple chain of evidence. They projected the doctored audio Curtis had submitted earlier, the one where Mom's voice seemed to declare her intent to pass the house to him. The distortion was subtle but clear, once pointed out, the kind of thing a desperate man might imagine he could slip past a court in the chaos of the holidays. The forensic analyst stepped forward and explained the anomalies, his tone steady, almost indifferent, as if exposing manipulation was just another day's work. When the clip ended, the courtroom seemed to tilt slightly. Curtis stared at the table jaw, twitching, his fingers pressed so tightly together they had gone pale. Mom leaned closer to me, whispering that she had never said anything close to what the clip implied. I nodded, though I already knew. Still hearing her say it out loud steadied something inside me. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened and Maggie Hale walked in. She wore a dark coat and moved with a deliberate carefulness, the kind of posture someone develops after years spent watching doorways more closely than people. The moment Curtis saw her, he froze. Shock reached him first, then disbelief, and finally a flicker of fear that rippled through his whole body. It was the first honest emotion I had seen on him since this nightmare began. Maggie took the stand. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. She described Curtis's methods, the way he used charm as an opener and pressure as a seal. She recalled the moment she discovered he had filed a deed behind her back, the same trap he'd laid for my mother. She didn't dwell on it, didn't dramatize, but the gravity in her voice made it unnecessary. The courtroom listened without moving. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Briggs was next. He presented the contents of the trunk, laying out the small but damning details, including the sealed box of Mom's heart medication and the printed timeline Curtis had drafted for the transfer of the house. He avoided sensationalism, choosing instead the quiet precision of facts. The jurors reacted the way people do when they realize something sinister had lived quietly beside them. A shift in posture, a heavy blink, a tightening of jaws. Wade unfolded the broader pattern. He outlined the forged affidavit that placed me out of state, the manipulated notary, the financial control, the subtle isolation tactics. His voice didn't rise, but the room seemed to narrow around his words. At one point, he placed a hand on the leather-bound trust my father had prepared decades earlier. The same trust that had shielded us when we didn't know we needed shielding. Curtis began to unravel. Small shakes at first, then tapping feet, then an outburst. He stood abruptly, shouting that none of them understood that no one was going to take the house away from him. His voice cracked at the end, not from anger, but something closer to panic. The bailiffs moved in quickly, guiding him back into his seat, though he kept muttering under his breath fragments of sentences that broke apart before anyone could interpret them. The judge warned him to remain silent. He didn't respond, but the fight drained from his shoulders. For a moment he simply stared at the snow outside the window, as if hoping it would swallow whatever future waited for him. The courtroom settled again. Wade leaned toward me and whispered that we were nearing the closing of evidence. My mother's hand tightened around mine once more, but her grip felt steadier now. She had watched the truth unfold piece by piece, each layer confirming what she had sensed, but had never dared speak aloud. There was fear in her eyes still, but something else had returned too. Something like the confidence she used to carry before Curtis entered her life. The judge called a brief recess. People stood stretching legs, adjusting coats. Snow continued to drift past the tall windows, heavy and slow, as if the storm outside had no interest in letting up. I walked with Mom toward the hallway where it was quieter. Her breath came out in soft puffs, fogging the air in front of her as she spoke. "It feels like your father is here," she whispered, not looking at me but at the floor, as though she were speaking partly to herself. I didn't answer, not because I disagreed, but because the truth of it sat so close to my throat that I couldn't speak around it. Instead, I placed a hand on her back and guided her toward a bench so she could rest until the judge called us in again. Down the hallway, the bailiffs led Curtis away for the recess. He glanced over his shoulder. His glare was different now, stripped of entitlement, sharpened into something colder. But beneath it, I caught a flash of something else. Defeat. Or maybe the realization that his long game, the one he believed was unbreakable, had finally cracked. When the bailiffs rounded the corner with him, the hallway went still. Only the distant echo of winter wind moved through the building. I looked back into the courtroom at the empty witness stand and the files stacked neatly on the table, all waiting for the next round. For the first time since this began, it felt like the floor beneath us had steadied. But the silence that followed held a different weight, as though something larger and darker had yet to reveal itself. The courthouse hallway smelled of wet wool and melting snow, and every step echoed in a way that made the morning feel sharper than the wind outside. I walked beside Mom, her hand small and cold in mine, and for a moment I wished I could turn back time to the years when she was the one leading me through crowded places. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and unforgiving, as if they intended to show every flaw in whatever truth was about to unfold. Inside the courtroom, people settled into wooden benches with the stiff movements of those who had braved a storm to be here. Curtis sat at the far table, shoulders drawn and his eyes darting around the room. He looked nothing like the man who once strutted through my mother's living room as if he owned it. He kept his jaw locked when we passed him, but the twitch in his fingers betrayed the fear under the anger. The judge entered and the room straightened. Papers rustled. Someone coughed. Wade stood with the quiet confidence of a man who had waited a long time for this moment. When Mom was called first, the room seemed to grow still enough to hear the heat vents clicking behind the walls. She took her seat, her breath shallow, her hands tightening on the wooden armrests. The judge asked if she was ready, and she nodded. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she described the months of isolation. She spoke of messages, intercepted appointments, redirected medications moved out of reach. She spoke of Curtis telling her she was confused, tired, mistaken. She spoke of long afternoons where she waited for a call from me that never came because he had silenced the phone. The courtroom did not move. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, leaned forward slightly as if listening was the only thing that mattered. Curtis shifted in his seat, leaning toward his attorney. He spoke quietly, trying to shape the narrative before it slipped away. But the judge's eyes stayed on Mom, giving her a space she had not had in months. When Wade presented the medical evaluation confirming she had been fully competent at the time of the signature, Curtis tensed. The analysis flattened his claim that she had been impaired, a claim he had repeated at every opportunity since the investigation began. The judge examined the report carefully, tapping one finger against the bench. The sound echoed through the room like the distant ticking of my father's old workshop clock. Briggs came next. He placed a folder on the table with a noticeable thump. The GPS log showed that Curtis had visited pharmacies repeatedly but had never picked up the medication Mom needed. Briggs's voice was calm as he explained how those patterns aligned with deliberate neglect. The judge's expression hardened and Curtis's face lost what remained of its color. Maggie stepped forward last. The room seemed to recognize her gravity before she even spoke. She opened a small notebook, its corners worn from years of being handled in hiding. Her voice was steady when she read Curtis's messages, the ones where he wrote about plans and timing and the expectation that soon my mother would no longer stand in his way. Curtis stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. His attorney tried to pull him back, but he leaned toward the judge, his voice rising. "That woman left her own life behind," he said. "She is lying." Maggie did not flinch. She only closed the notebook as if his outburst confirmed everything she had lived through. The judge lifted a hand, signaling for silence. When the room settled, he delivered his decision with a measured tone. The TOD deed was void. The protective trust crafted years before by my father was activated pending a final review. The judge referred the evidence for a deeper criminal investigation but did not announce any final charges. His words were careful, deliberate, a reminder that this was not the end of the battle but the beginning of one fought in the open. Curtis was not handcuffed, not yet, but two deputies stepped closer enough to remind him he was no longer the one with control. He stared at me without blinking, his jaw tight, his face twisted into something between fury and disbelief. It was not the expression of a man defeated. It was the look of someone calculating what he had left. That look stayed with me as the judge adjourned the hearing and people began to move again. Their voices low, their coats brushing against the benches. Snow tapped against the tall windows, carried seaways by the wind. Mom's hand found my arm and I helped her stand. She leaned into me more out of emotion than weakness. In the hallway, the lights buzzed overhead, casting long reflections on the polished floor. Wade walked beside us, quiet for the first time since the ordeal began. Briggs spoke briefly with the deputies, then stepped toward us, offering a small nod that felt heavier than words. Mom exhaled slowly, as if she had held her breath through the entire hearing. I tightened my arm around her, the cold air from the stairwell drifting against us. We had exposed the truth, but the weight in my chest told me something was still unresolved, held back intentionally, waiting just beyond the fluorescent glow. A question lingered in the silence, one we all sensed, but no one yet dared to speak. And I knew we were not finished. Not until the final piece showed itself. Not until the last shadow stepped forward. The courthouse steps were nearly empty when we came out. Wind slid through the columns and carried a fine mist of snow across the parking lot. It wasn't the kind of cold that bites, more the kind that stays with you after the door shuts, like a memory you can't shake off. Mom walked close to my side, her gait careful but steadier than it had been in months. I kept my arm ready for her weight, though she didn't lean on me much. That alone felt like a quiet victory. We drove back in silence. The heater in my truck clicked and sighed, pushing warm air over the dash. Mom held her gloves in her lap and looked out at the winter fields sliding by, pale and still. I watched her profile, the way her jaw had unclenched, the way her breathing had found its rhythm again. My chest felt tired more than anything. Not emptied, just worn down to something honest. The week that followed moved slow. Folks in town went back to their routines as if a storm had passed and the roads were open again. Wade called to say the trust was in place and locked tight, that the court orders stood while the investigation continued. He didn't paint it as a finish line. He called it safety for now. I appreciated that. Life rarely ties itself off with a neat bow. It just gives you a chance to breathe between storms. The morning I brought Mom home, the driveway was lined with old snow, crusted and gray at the edges. The house stood there the way it always had, stubborn and weathered, holding its ground against every winter that tried to take it. Mom paused on the front walk, and for a second I felt her hesitation travel up my arm. She looked at the porch, the windows, the roofline my father rebuilt with his own hands after the fire, then the door. "I'm ready," she said. Her voice surprised me, clear, quiet, certain. Inside, the warmth had a smell. Wood, cinnamon, and the faint trace of the pine wreath I'd hung after Curtis was gone. The furnace rattled once and settled into a steady hum. I had started a casserole earlier, same one my wife used to make when the first snow came. I nearly burned it like I always do, but the smell still felt like home. Mom eased into her chair by the window. The old family photo sat on the mantel where it had been since I was a kid, my father in his work coat. My mother tucked close to his side, me and my wife, younger and laughing, a world that still believed in simple futures. I hadn't moved it through any of this. I think I was afraid of what it would mean to touch it. I went out to the porch with my tools. The left rail had been loose for years, a job I'd put off the way men put off things that matter because they think there will always be another season. I tightened the bolts, replaced a warped board, sanded the rough edge until it was smooth under my palm. Each click of the wrench felt like a small answer to a bigger question, not spoken, not dramatic, just true. When I was done, I carried out the old box of Christmas lights. The cord came out tangled, stubborn as ever. My father used to pretend he hated dealing with that mess, grumbling until my mother laughed and handed him coffee. Then he'd untie it like it was a ritual only he understood. Sitting on the step, I worked the knots loose, slowly feeling the cold through my jeans, listening to the quiet creak of the porch boards and the steady breath of the house behind me. Mom watched through the window. The last daylight laid a stripe of soft gold across her hands. She stayed quiet a long time, then her voice came through the screen door. "I should have told you sooner." I set the lights down and went back inside. I knelt beside her chair the way I used to when I was a boy, needing something she didn't always have the words for. I wasn't brave, Graham. I was scared of being alone. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't let the tears fall. I felt my throat tighten. For a moment I saw her the way she was when I was little, tired at the end of a workday, still trying to make a home feel safe. I took her hand. All I needed was you here. Safe. Breathing. That was the spike. Not loud, not theatrical, just the truth landing where it had to. Mom's shoulders shook once, then she let out a long breath that sounded like years leaving her lungs. She squeezed my hand back, and in that squeeze I felt something old unclench in me too. My phone buzzed later, just as the sky outside started turning navy blue. My son's name lit the screen. I hadn't expected it, not today. We'd been talking more lately, short calls, cautious hope, him checking in after hearing fragments of what happened. Not prying, just present in the way young men are when they don't want to get it wrong. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I'm nearby. I heard the hearing went your way." "Yeah, we're home now." Another pause. I heard a turn signal clicking on his end. "I've been wanting to come by all week," he said. "I didn't want to crowd you. But I'd like to see Grandma and you." "Come on over," I said. When he pulled in, the porch light was on. Snow clung to his boots as he climbed the steps with a paper bag in one hand. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, more settled in his own skin. His eyes carried that same mix of caution and caring I recognized in myself. He stepped inside, saw Mom, and his face softened in a way that made my chest ache. "Hi, Grandma," he said, kneeling beside her chair. Mom lifted a shaking hand and touched his cheek. He took her hand without hesitation. I watched them for a long second, feeling the odd, quiet symmetry of it. My father had protected this house. I had protected my mother. Now my son was here, measuring the shape of family in real time. We ate together, nothing fancy, just warmed casserole and the cookies my son had picked up from a diner off the highway. Mom insisted he take more. He did. The room didn't fill with big talk. It filled with the kind of normal that feels sacred after fear. After dinner, I went back outside with the lights. My son followed, no words needed. He took one end of the strand and we worked side by side, testing each section before we hung it. Our breath rising white in the cold. The porch boards creaked under our weight the way they always had. When we finally plugged them in, the bulbs lit up in a steady amber glow, no flicker, no warning. Just warmth spreading across the white yard, turning the snow into something softer. Mom watched from the window, her face lit gold. The old family photo behind her caught that light too, my father's face half-shadowed, half-warm, like he was still standing in the doorway he built. My son stood beside me, hands in his coat pockets. "Looks like it always should have," he said. I nodded. Curtis once told me this house wasn't mine, standing there with my mother safe inside and my son next to me. That sentence felt like smoke in the cold air, something that disappears the moment you stop feeding it. I didn't need to argue with it anymore. I didn't need to prove anything. The porch light was off now, and the Christmas lights did their quiet work on their own. Behind us, the door stayed open, a crack, warm air spilling into the winter night. We stood there a little longer, then went inside together.